if that worked. Yeah, great. Welcome also from my side. Very happy to have again another very exciting NESTwebinar with Adrian Smith today. Adrian is Professional Fellow in Technology and Society at SPRU, or the Science Policy Research Unit in Sussex in the UK, where he worked since 1997. Yeah, he's a visiting scholar also at the Polytechnic University of Madrid. And he has 3 core research teams. The first one, transformation of complex socio-technical systems and transitions to sustainability. The second one, where he works on our critical policy analysis. And the third one, our grassroots innovations. And that will be also the topic of today. So we have a very established scholar here, and we're all very happy to hear what you can bring us on this topic. And then I will just hand over the floor to you, Adrian.
Many thanks, Magtel, and thanks to Noor and Abba as well for kindly inviting me and organising everything and putting together this amazing webinar series. And yeah, I feel kind of honoured to be invited to kind of do this. I hope what I'm about to say is useful and kind of worthy of being on a YouTube channel. I'm just going to share my screen before we get into it, and then hopefully so hopefully coming up in a moment you'll have the first slide. Is that, maybe one of you could?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Great. Okay. I could talk a very long time about grassroots innovations. But what I'm going to do, what I thought I'd try and do is first I'll kind of, some of you maybe, I mean, I didn't want to presume how much or how little all of you here are familiar with it and how much you're researching it yourselves, etc. So I thought I'd begin with a kind of brief, kind of fairly sort of simple kind of introduction to what I might kind of mean by or understand by grassroots innovations. And then I thought, given that we're a network of you know, earlier career researchers, it might be interesting to see how I got into the topic, if you like. So the sort of diversity of projects through which I've been able to kind of think a little bit and analyze and maybe accompany grassroots innovators and kind of maybe try and help and support them in their endeavors. But then I thought I'd sort of then make just a few kind of high level points about grassroots innovation as a phenomena. So I'm not really, rather than go into kind of more detailed analyses of like who participates, who doesn't, questions of inclusion, exclusion, and so forth, or indeed how grassroots innovations are organized and so forth, and how they kind of operate, and how they move around from one place to another. That we could get into in the discussion very happily, but I thought sort of higher level points might be a bit more sort of stimulating for discussion. And then I'll sort of finish by reflecting on some of the concepts, one particular concept that you'll be familiar with in this network, which is analyzing this stuff as sort of niche spaces. But if we're running out of time a bit, I might go through that last bit somewhat quickly. Have a lot of slides. Some are too wordy, and I will go through them relatively quickly, and I thought that was okay. I'm cheating a bit here, given that this is being recorded and there's a chance to maybe, if there's slides or information that looks interesting, you know, people can go back or they can pause the video, etc. But anyway, let's hope this is all useful for you. So starting with definitions, really, I still think something that a colleague Jill Seafang and I came up with when we were first sort of getting into and thinking about grassroots innovation works, which is that, you know, and others seem to have kind of found it useful as well. Others have criticized it, but anyway, this is how we understand it, if you like, just as a point of departure, that this grassroots innovation is a sort of diverse set of activities in which networks of neighbours, community groups and activists work with people to generate bottom-up solutions for sustainable development. These are often novel solutions that respond to the local situation and the interests and values of the communities involved, so novel to them, and where these communities have control over the process and outcomes. And that all began because Jill and I independently were researching kind of local environmental action and various kinds of environmental movements, and noticing that as well as maybe mobilizing to demand rights and press for policy changes or recognition of new issues in society, they were often also coming up with alternative kind of material cultures, if you like, alternative ways of producing things, alternative arrangements for consuming things that they hoped would be more sustainable or more socially just in some way. So that's why we thought, well, let's look at this stuff, this creative activity as a form of innovation that's quite different to mainstream innovation. And that's what this diagram kind of indicates down here. So, you know, very crudely, we've got kind of, you know, the sort of processes of innovation on the vertical axis and the outcomes of that innovation, which includes problems as well as benefits, if you like, risks and benefits. And grassroots innovation, you know, generally, it's very difficult to generalize across the heterogeneity of situations and activities, but nevertheless, we sort of try to, and very sort of simplistically, grassroots innovation is often very open and participatory, often has to be in order to sustain itself, and works very much at the local level and collectively, even though there are kind of global networks and regional networks trying to support that activity going on. And that contrasts, if you like, with maybe conventional innovation, or certainly the way it's seen by science, technology, and innovation policymakers, which sees the, you know, the development of innovations and technologies and new organizational innovations or service innovations in processes that tend to be quite closed, heavily institutionalized, and quite distant and private from the end users, if you like. And I've just put some bullet points up there to sort of elaborate that a little bit and draw out this distinction. Now, it's useful to kind of make this a bit more concrete with some examples, and you see there a long list of a few examples of sort of innovations, almost like artifacts or new organizational things or services that have come from grassroots initiative, or not necessarily. I mean, one debate in this research is whether these innovations have to, if you try and trace their genealogy, they start within a local community or within a grassroots setting. They're sort of endogenous to them and they emerge out of that. People like Anil Gupta, who founded the Honeybee Network in India, has sort of talked about grassroots innovations as that. It's kind of this sort of community ingenuity to create things, and that's what the kind of starting point and the defining feature for grassroots innovation. I think in my work, it's been a bit more flexible, and have sort of also tried to include maybe organizations or activists that maybe are exogenous to the grassroots, if you like, or they're working in the grassroots in a different way, and they're bringing kind of ideas or innovations or technologies to these grassroots settings. And I guess the important thing, just going back to my other slide, is in those encounters, it is the grassroots, it's the communities, it's the people working at grassroots level that are very much in control of the process and that will benefit from those sorts of encounters, if you like. It's a grey area, I know. We could talk to whether it's possible even to draw hard and fast boundaries. I'm not sure, but we could maybe come back to that in the discussion. Returning to a few examples, though, I mean, an example, if you like, of maybe a kind of a grassroots innovation that may be initiated by activists wanting to engage with grassroots is the first picture up here, which is sort of rainwater harvesting, and where you have kind of engineers, I'll maybe come back to this in a moment, engineers that develop kind of self-build forms of developing rainwater harvesting for households and communities in different parts of the world, and include them from the outset in whether they want that sort of technology and process, and in the building and the creation of it, and in its maintenance and running, and they get the sort of benefits from that. So there's a sort of, you know, innovativeness in the processes as well as this sort of artifact that's produced out of that. There are organizational innovations coming from the grassroots. So the photo there of everyone in front of the car is the Som Mobilitat cooperative in Spain, looking at kind of community-owned and shared electric vehicles. The black and white photo is, you know, I can't remember his name now, a kind of pioneer of small-scale wind energy in the UK. But just to sort of note that a lot of kind of modern wind energy technologies can be traced back to alternative technology movements, particularly in countries like Denmark, and where, again, cooperative economic models enabled them to further develop and enhance these technologies. And then there's all sorts of other things in here. The bottom left picture is a example of citizen science or monitoring, creating monitoring networks to build awareness and relations with environmental phenomena, or make them more apparent to people. In this case, it was about noise in a square and trying to mobilize action to address that noise. Community Wi-Fi networks, community supported agriculture, and then things like the honeybee network support, people appropriating and subverting artifacts and coming up with innovative ways of using them, such as taking the motive power of bicycles or mopeds or motorbikes and kind of bolting onto that sort of processing technologies to help with food processing or production and economic activity and so forth. And then also, quite low or straightforward technologies. So the photo of the peppers there is the Zeerpot, which is a kind of a water cooled or an evaporative kind of refrigeration system. So you wet the sand in the outer pot, which then evaporates in the heat to cool the inner pot. And so you get a kind of, electricity free off-grid cooling that can help preserve food stuffs and help you get them to market in good condition and so forth. And as I say, on the list, there's loads of examples. And actually, if you tune in and begin to look, you notice these things in very many different places around the world. So taking something from that, what can we say about, grassroots innovation, sort of what kind of characteristics might it have? I think first, there's a kind of openness to all of this activity that permits sharing of ideas, and resources, and most importantly, experience and almost support and solidarity. You often see the emergence of intermediary organizations. They can be voluntary associations, they can be kind of formal organizations that emerge to support and network this activity and sort of draw lessons. I mean, if you like, in kind of niche terms, you've got all the local grassroots experiments going on, and then these intermediaries are kind of helping to construct that global niche level by mobilizing resources, lessons, and advocating for grassroots innovation. The activities themselves are often motivated both for material and ideological reasons. So maybe a material need and actually trying to improve someone's sort of well-being by providing something that the local state or markets are not actually making available, or for ideological reasons, like amongst sort of European environmental movements, if you like, where the forms of that provision currently by the state or market are deemed to be problematic and unsustainable, and there's a search for meeting those sort of needs in alternative forms, much more sustainable forms. These sorts of searches and activity often relies upon voluntarism and solidarity and a high degree of kind of social entrepreneurship. And it's a global undercurrent of activity. It flourishes and struggles at different times and places in diverse forms. It kind of consolidates in places and then kind of gets diminished, if you like. And there's a few examples in the bullet points there, but I'll provide more in a few slides. And sometimes it gets the attraction of policymakers. It's often beneath the radar, certainly of like ministries of science, technology, and innovation. Maybe social. Yeah, I'll come back to that. And so it's like, oh, there's all this interesting creativity here. This is quite useful for our agendas around social inclusion, say, or local agenda 21 historically, or when governments were interested in appropriate technology in international development, they would open up and fund appropriate technology development centres around the world and so forth. So you get these periods when there's added possibility, if you like, but also challenges and risks of misunderstanding when policy kind of takes notice and tries to get involved, whether that's for promoting reasons of social inclusion, because it sees in this entrepreneurship marketable innovations that could be scaled up and rolled out elsewhere, or because it's useful activity in terms of improving human development. So that's sort of 10 minutes or so of what is, getting us into thinking about grassroots innovation. How did I become involved in it? And this is one of the slides with way too much text on it, but listed kind of in chronological order as sort of projects I've had the good fortune to work in, a few of which are about grassroots innovation per se. I'll talk about one in a moment, but often it's been other projects where I've been researching some technology, some community or history, if you like, and there's been an interesting kind of grassroots element. And I think it's important to kind of get that across sometimes. And also, so what started on me on sort of this, if you like, was looking at histories of alternative technology movements, organic food movements and eco-housing movements in the UK, not long after, a few years after completing my PhD. And then that was sort of the research that I was doing when I, I started collaborating with Jill Seafang, and then we were lucky enough to get a proposal funded looking at community energy in the UK back in 2010, and looking at that from an innovation and niche perspective. So in that project, we were interested in the intermediaries and the relations between local community energy projects and intermediaries, and very much using a kind of strategic niche management kind of framework. But in other projects here, we've been using doing like social movement studies of some of these things, or looking at knowledge politics questions in bottom-up smart urbanism initiatives, or drawing on a variety of kind of concepts to develop theory of social innovation that's transformative, and it's not always necessarily a kind of grassroots phenomenon. And then more recently, looking at kind of maker spaces, which I'll talk about in a moment, but how does kind of grassroots access and appropriation to digital design and fabrication technologies and tools for making things, how does that expand or inhibit their human capabilities? So using analytical frameworks for analyzing human capabilities, if you like. So, and then I've had the and then looking at drawing on it in work on sort of post-automation most recently, which is noticing how in appropriating some of these digital technologies, a lot of these grassroots initiatives actually quite subvert technologies that under the kind of framework or discourse of the fourth industrial revolution are intended to automate people out of the picture. And people are actually subverting these technologies in ways that emphasize human creativity and conviviality, and putting people at the center of the technologies in different ways, and kind of coming up with a way of sort of, actually, although very marginal, nevertheless sort of reminds us that there's nothing kind of automatic about automation and automating technologies. So looking at that very much from a kind of a sort of political sort of point of view. And then I've had the good fortune of supervising some brilliant doctoral researchers who brought their own kind of frameworks and approaches to things. So as you see, it's been quite a meandering kind of journey, using different kind of analytical and conceptual supports to take me along it, and not always very easily joined up. But that's kind of like how kind of research proceeds, I think, in my experience. Now, though, I think the one project in that list was this study of grassroots innovation movements. So I thought I'd talk about that a little bit, because then it opens up some of the big issues I want to say to lead us into discussion, if you like. And this was a project that I kind of coordinated with colleagues Mariana Freseli at Fundación Cenit in Buenos Aires, Dinesh Abrol at JNU in Delhi, Elisa Arond, who was doing her PhD at the time at Clark University in the States and now based in Stockholm Environment Institute in Bogota, and then my colleague Adrian Smith and myself here at SPRU. And we did this project under the STEP Centre, which is a large research centre looking at all sorts of projects around the world in different regions, looking at social, technological and environmental pathways to sustainability. And this was a fantastic project, really. It was a real privilege to be involved in it. We were able to, well, let me put up the slide. We looked at 6 different, what we call grassroots innovation movements. So these were kind of networks and movements that weren't necessarily trying to do grassroots innovation in a particular field like agroecology or housing. They were kind of movements that were trying to promote and support and give value to and get institutional backing for grassroots innovation as we defined it. They didn't always use these terms in their movements, but for that innovativeness in the grassroots more generally. Okay, so whatever the sector or field or technology. And the ones we did a mix of, some were historical and they kind of emerged and then disappeared in time, and you know, some left their traces, others not. Some were much more current and live, if you like, and are still working at this and struggling to promote grassroots innovation. And so, yeah, you can see here, we looked at the movement for socially useful production, which is a workers' movement coming up through grassroots trade unionism and socialism in the UK in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which was trying to democratize the development and use of technologies in the workplace. And we kind of looked at the history of that and interviewed various protagonists from that. Below that, you can see the People's Science Movement in India, which began in the 1960s as a kind of science literacy kind of project and movement, trying to make scientific education and works available to people in their local languages in India, and then developed and changed into movements that were concerned about using about local development and the production of knowledge for like environmental sustainability. Next to that, you can see we did a study of the appropriate technology movement in South America in the 1970s and 80s. Above that is a study of hacker spaces, maker spaces, and fab labs. So these networks of workshops that provide tools and training to people to kind of just walk in and learn how to design and make things if they're that way inclined. The Social Technologies Network in Brazil, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then the Honeybee Network, which I mentioned already in relation to Arnav Gupta in India, and that has done tremendous work in scouting and documenting grassroots inventions and innovations around rural India, including organising Shodhyatras, where people, you know, an organised walk every year in a region from village to village, kind of it's scouting and engaging and kind of making visible and lifting up kind of grassroots inventiveness, and has actually led to the development of policies in India sort of dedicated to promoting that work and connecting individual grassroots innovators with kind of institutions and agencies that can help them develop their ideas into products and services and so forth. But I thought out of all of them, I'd just mention the Social Technologies Network. So Rede de Tecnologias Sociais in, well, my bad Portuguese, as an example of, and queuing up some of the kind of broader points and themes that actually you sort of notice, or I've noticed across those projects kind of recurring, if you like, and playing out very differently for different circumstances and places and time. But nevertheless, they're kind of dilemmas, if you like, that kind of recur, and grassroots innovators are always, and their movements are always sort of navigating, if you like. One point before going into the Social Technologies Network, though, I forgot to point you towards the 4 bullet points at the bottom, which is how we went about studying these different social movements in a way that was sort of it was a real challenge, because they all have different histories and come from different parts of the world. Us as a team, similarly, so the way we would go about analyzing that was different. So it took a while to come up with a framework that we were all kind of comfortable with, that we thought would be suitable to and flexible enough to kind of respecting the differences across time and place, if you like, but nevertheless was sort of consistent enough approach for us to be able to kind of have dialogues across them. So we kind of drew, I guess, crudely, there's more to it than this, looking at sort of ideas about new social movements and concepts from that, and then also kind of the niche development and socio-technical kind of transformation from the margins. And so we, in each case study, we wanted to understand, okay, what's the context here? What's the history that's actually brought about this movement, and that's sort of setting the scene for how it goes about doing its task. We wanted to study the framings within each movement, which could be multiple, so the ways of making sense of what they're doing and what counts as success, if you like, and what the problem is and so forth. How the movement frames the kind of challenges, the wider world, but also its own identity as a movement. And then we analysed what sort of spaces they were opening up, what strategies they were deploying to recognize and promote grassroots innovation. All the kind of creativity I was referring to in the earlier slides. Okay, so what do you do as a kind of network or movement to try and promote that and make it more visible, advocate for it? And then in doing that, what were the kind of pathways? How did things develop over time? What were dead ends? What worked? What kind of mutated into something else? And what ultimately kind of, you know, became of them, if you like. So as an illustration, we looked at the social technologies network in Brazil. This emerged, interestingly, in the early 2000s amongst activists initially who'd been experienced with appropriate technology movements earlier. So the other case study we've seen where there'd been programs to promote with appropriate technology, so like smaller scale, lower technologies, accessible and amenable to communities of various sorts, that were that they could maintain, that would give them some kind of development benefit, and ideally, and as the activists soon learned, had to be developed with and from the communities themselves, rather than kind of like trying to, you know, give or market to them a kind of pro-poor technology. So there were reflections on that earlier experience going on, and people kind of starting to talk about this idea of social technologies, activists, academics and so forth, and thinking about technology in a quite different way to the kind of to the kind of conventional innovation policy, if you like, in Brazil. And an opportunity for those discussions and that the sort of promotion and work was the election and winning of power of Lula in 2003, and the Workers' Party coming into government created opportunities, and a team was formed in the Ministry of Science and Technology for participatory approaches to socially inclusive technologies. And then some social foundations of Petrobras and Banco do Brasil, two state organizations, funded a formal network called the Social Technologies Network, and that was supported by the Ministry of Science and Technology to kind of organize and facilitate and initiate social technology programs, studies, conferences. There were prizes as well each year to promote this social technologies approach. What do we mean by that? And the next bullet here is for the activists. What they meant by social technologies is to think about the development and use of technologies not as a sort of not as a specific artifact that can provide a solution to a specific problem, though that is important, but also to really focus in on the processes around that technology in terms of making it happen, or using it and maintaining it, and trying to organize that, and therefore develop the artifact in a way that built up solidarity and local development within kind of communities. They saw how universities, rather than being suppliers of appropriate technologies, actually become incubators for those processes, or provide research and support services that are on tap, if you like. They're interested in working with cooperatives and solidarity economy, and trying to think about how these technologies and innovations would kind of be consistent and work within those kinds of economic organizational arrangements. These are very much community-led developments, and as I said, there's a focus in building transferable community capabilities for innovation, rather than the kind of where the Ministry of Science and Technology may more conventionally have focused on how do we in Brazil develop science and technology for catch-up industrialization, and always trying to catch the next sort of wave, if you like. So a different approach, a way of conceiving and approaching technology and technology policy. Meanwhile, within the network, corporate and state interests were more interested in the diffusion of pro-poor technologies as part of a social development program. And so, looking at some of the artifacts that were being created from these initiatives as solutions, punctual solutions that you could then make available through the market or through state programs to kind of improve the lives of people, which is, which happened, but maybe doesn't kind of not so concerned about the local networks and capability building that's involved. An example there is what was called the Cisterna program, which was a rainwater harvesting program. I mentioned rainwater harvesting earlier, and actually the photo in that earlier slide is taken from Social Technologies Network, where the activists involved were trying to think about rainwater harvesting as giving households some autonomy, a degree of autonomy, but having to rely less on water tankers shipping in water and having to pay whatever price and wait around all day for the tanker to arrive, etc. And that sort of kind of dependency, you know, providing some rainwater services and a degree of kind of self-reliance or autonomy from precarious forms of water provision through the technology, but also all of these kinds of local development kind of processes and benefits and solidarity, if you like. And so that's why there was this self-build and community organizing approach to implementing and creating those rainwater harvesting systems in villages and in households around the northeastern semi-arid region of Brazil. That takes time. It's labor intensive. But the argument is that the development benefits of that are deeper and more profound and can be spun off into all sorts of other improvements amongst the local community, okay, and empowers them to make all sorts of other demands and be creative in all sorts of other ways. Against that is the sheer scale of people suffering water precarity in the region, and a kind of corporate and state interest in these. Rainwater harvesting is an interesting pro-poor technology, so let's just buy a load of mass-produced ones and ship them out and donate or sell them at low cost to households, which is what they did. And indeed, what was interesting with Cisterna is that then prompted some protests and even street manifestations about trying to resurrect and retain at least some of the kind of self-build program, which they managed to do. But I think it's illustrative of the sort of tensions, if you like, in grassroots innovation. Is it a source of appropriable, scalable ideas, or is it an expression of a deeper movement for social transformation? And those tensions and conflicts, if you like, and differences in the way the social technology networks is framed led eventually to the demise and the breakup of the network in 2012. And you know, social technologies initiatives and research and the ideas persist, but without that kind of government back sort of network, if you like, at least in the period when we were studying it. Another example is hackerspaces, makerspaces, and Fab Labs one. Maybe in the interest of time, I might go through this a bit more rapidly, and is illustrative of not so. Some of this has emerged from the grassroots. Others is more coming from institutions creating these workshops, like educational facilities or organizations, like some government programs. Let's create these spaces where people can come in and access digital design and fabrication tools, training, peer support networks, but also they're networked globally with open source designs and instructions and ideas and possibilities for distant collaborations across distance in the design and making things, of shaping your material culture, or at least learning how things work a bit. And I was really intrigued, remain really intrigued in this as a way of potentially helping to democratize what are increasingly technological societies, and where the kind of conventional development of them technologies is increasingly enclosing them in black boxes. So we just don't know kind of how they work, and we feel very alienated from their consequences in having any agency. And I wondered if you get here with these networks of workshops, some which do come from the grassroots and are organized within communities as sort of more voluntary spaces and projects, how that can kind of redistribute prototyping capabilities in societies. And it's not like that everyone has to kind of go to their local workshop, but what happens when, you know, 5 or 10% of a community, where there's this sort of move within grassroots, start kind of designing and making things. Now, some of the things they design and make are highly unsustainable. The sustainability dimension of this is probably still in the realm of possibility. That's what we learned in our research, rather than reality. But nevertheless, I think it's a possibility that needs further attention and promotion, if you like. And it does enable.
Just a reminder for the time, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maxwell. Okay, so you get the image. you get the kind of view. But again, the bottom bullet point here, as with the previous example, are these spaces, they're framed in multiple ways, if you like. How they help grassroots innovation or how they express it, enable expression, is sometimes in terms of arts producing socially useful artifacts, sometimes through emphasizing the community development processes. Sometimes they're looked to, particularly by kind of public agencies and public funding, as source hubs and incubators for entrepreneurship and startup economic opportunity. Academics like me are interested in it as the democratization of technology, but so are activists as well. And others see this as a way of kind of, you know, for territorial autonomy or solidarity, enabling people to kind of, as some of the photos show here, actually kind of change their neighborhood in ways that they see fit, rather than it being imposed upon them, through the collaborative manufacture of street furniture and in reclaiming spaces that might have been lost to otherwise lost, if you like, and recovering them. Okay, so I have a few more slides. I'm going to go a bit more quickly to the sort of, I have four, having kind of introduced it a bit, okay, in a bit of a random way, apologies for that. I want to mention four kind of dilemmas, if you like, that kind of feed the sort of politics of grassroots innovation, reasons why we might disagree, or people might disagree either within grassroots innovation, or policymakers that want to support it or dismiss it or what have you. Sort of some of the sources for that, thinking about this politically. And the first slide here is just to notice the institutional misfits, if you like. And these are all things that came from the Grassroots Innovation Movements project, but also keep popping up in various other kind of forms of research. So I don't have time to go through this table, but basically it's just drawing presenting the kind of contrast between, if you like, grassroots innovation movements as I've been describing them, and then how science, technology and innovation institutions approach innovation, and drawing the contrast in terms of the protagonists involved, the priorities, the incentives and drivers, locations of activity, and maybe with a bit more time you can see how these are kind of radically different worlds, if you like. So there's a misfit. The grassroots innovation doesn't kind of fit readily into our prevailing institutions. There's a negotiation that's required. It's also important to note that there's the diversity of things that get produced by this work in grassroots innovation, whether voluntary work or otherwise. Yeah. So this image is just kind of listing some of them. You know, there's artifacts that's produced, there's new knowledge that's produced, there's methods, there's new identities and subjectivities, like a maker or a hacker, or a social technologist. There are social values that get emphasized, new narratives are produced, and so forth. Okay. And so there's a questions about where's the value in all of this production? What gets valued the most and by whom, and therefore maybe find it easier to circulate? What gets marginalized or always overlooked? And the other interesting thing here is that sometimes the production of an artifact relies upon all these other things. It needs good networks, it needs shared knowledge and so forth. But some forms of supporting grassroots innovation, where you try to identify a group or an individual and try and support them, kind of almost draws a ring around all the other relationships that brought that grassroots innovation or that bottom-up social innovation into being. And there's less investment in their reproduction compared to, let's just try and scale up and market this artifact. The third kind of dilemma or point here to some of the stuff that's come out of the research I've been involved in is differences over strategies as kind of a network promoting grassroots innovation, or even as an individual kind of group of people doing your grassroots innovation. Do you align with existing institutions and try and present what you're doing and change it in a way that meets their agendas and priorities and wins support from them in some way, whether it's a grant or some a workshop space, a physical space, access to people, so on and so forth. Okay, and if you like, the top image there is, you know, in doing that, maybe some of this diversity of things gets produced, gets kind of filtered out, and is not supported by those institutional arrangements. Okay, so it's to do with, say, marketing and scaling up. Some things work and align quite readily in what you're doing, so you become it's easier to get support and grants to do kind of like participatory design and roll that out in communities as a new method, or there might be some artifacts that you've produced that are really interesting to institutions like conventional innovation agencies or what have you, and they scale up. Or that's one strategy, and it's effective and it can achieve loads of fantastic things. But the second strategy, much more challenging and demanding, is whether you kind of resist that co-option, if you like. You might see that as being co-opted, and you actually keep pressing for transforming institutions. Actually, what we're doing is deliberately a misfit, because we see the problem as being these institutions. We're trying in our grassroots innovation to come up with material activities that anticipate quite a different world, and we can learn about where those misfits work, and we can develop strategies for trying to address them by actually through these kind of agit-prop practical kind of ways of doing grassroots innovation. So we want to kind of see the design of institutions and use our activities to push and join with other alliances and mobilizations to transform institutions in a way that they value and help circulate the full suite of things that we're producing, if you like. And that's sort of what the bottom image is trying to capture. Okay, only a few more slides, okay, because this is the fourth and final kind of general point, if you like. And it's whether we're talking in grassroots innovation about autonomy or inclusion. Here, and the thinking here has been very much kind of, I've been kind of inspired a bit by a couple of current doctoral researchers I'm supervising, Pablo and Jorge, who both looking at kind of grassroots innovations in Mexico. So Jorge's looking at convivial technologies and grassroots innovation in Oaxaca, where these technology developments like community radio, appropriate technologies, Wi-Fi networks are seen within indigenous movements that are trying to resist kind of the colonizations of modernity and to kind of retain and build and strengthen their cultures and their worldviews, if you like, through the use of these tools and technologies are technologies for resistance. Not so much about scaling up, it's about building and retaining autonomy. Okay, they're not interested in being included in something else. It's about kind of using these technologies to what's the word, nurture and enrich their kind of traditions or worlds, if you like, and how they see the well-being of their communities. Jorge's study around rainwater harvesting in Mexico, in the interest of time, I've already said things about rainwater harvesting and with the cisterna example, and you see those dynamics a bit in his study of Mexico City. Here it begins with a social entrepreneurship of rainwater harvesting and trying to develop systems that help precarious neighborhoods, studying that, but then how that gets incorporated into sort of city programs. And the interesting thing here in the city, if you like, is how rainwater harvesting is kind of patching up a broken infrastructure, or an infrastructure, you know, in terms of a kind of modern ideal for water supply and pipes and across the city, that doesn't work all the time for all neighborhoods, or where you have some neighborhoods that just are not connected at all. And the rainwater harvesting provides a very helpful and real way of kind of overcoming some of the disadvantages you experience at that. But then at the same time is just a patchwork, and whether that kind of, how that kind of undermines or how that relates to demand for more adequate water resources, if you like. Does it kind of take the pressure off, using a hydrological metaphor, to do something better or different with water supply? Okay. The other thing with these, I could say, is that a lot of grassroots innovation not necessarily about sustainability transitions. It is about sustainable developments often, but as some of my examples indicate, not always. And certainly the transformations that are being sought aren't always how we might, in the sustainability transitions research network and ST communities, to kind of see them. You know, it may be about retaining some sort of autonomy and resisting the imposition of transformations that disadvantage you, or where you're excluded in some way and are socially unjust. Okay, Given the audience, I was going to say something about niche analysis. I might do this very quickly because you probably are familiar with these, but just to say that when I've used this, which is pertinent to this network and community, originally I was seeing kind of grassroots innovation as developments in the niche space, using some of the, you know, strategic niche management and other ideas, plus the relations with the wider sort of social context. And I still find that incredibly useful and use it. I think in doing some of this research with grassroots innovations and looking at the heterogeneity and the different framings involved, I've kind of, it becomes a bit more complex, and find useful these three perspectives. This text is quite small here. I don't know if you can read it, and there's a lot, so I'm going to go through it. But basically, whether we frame as analysts or as policymakers or as facilitators or whatever, or people working in the grassroots, do we frame, how helpful is it when we frame what we're doing as strategic niche management, which would then emphasize local experiments in particular ways? It'd be very much about creating scalable socio-technical configurations, perhaps, and knowledge priorities about how to do that practically. Niche intermediation is about sharing what works and maybe help to standardize things, and the politics is quite evidence-based. Or do we think about that, what we're trying to do here from a more like what we call a niche policy advocacy perspective, which is about trying to influence policymakers and build up out of our grassroots innovation activities kind of narratives and policy ideas and things to kind of better support them. And local experiments are trying to kind of explore that and make that kind of concrete and make a case for that and so forth. And intermediation is trying to do that advocacy kind of work. And so the politics there is about, you know, more pluralistic and argumentative, about trying to persuade policy organisations to support grassroots innovations in the ways that we think in our niche are the best ways of doing it. Or does the perspective need to be much more critical? What we're doing here is kind of is a kind of anticipating future worlds, and what we're doing is much more antagonistic politically. We're trying to build up awareness and critical knowledge of some of the deeper structures that are impeding and making difficult a radically redistributed way of designing and manufacturing, for example, to take the maker spaces. You know, what kind of political economy, what kind of cultures would that be realistic and credible in? Okay, and to do it sustainably, and remanufacture and repair and so forth, and think about our artifacts in commons-based ways, as a commons, as some of the designers and makers in these spaces see artifacts. Yeah, what kind of world does that? So that, you know, the critical niches perspective is trying to think about that and advocate for that. So I think that's where I'll finish. I'll skip the one about policies. I could come back to that and just sum up. What I said is, argued maybe the grassroots innovation is widespread, long-standing activity, typically trying to meet needs unmet by markets and states, necessarily comes in diverse forms and produces a wide variety of valuable things, and therefore needs lots of sensitivity and a variety of kind of analytical frameworks and approaches to understanding and accompanying and helping grassroots innovation, which is the next point. It can be studied through different analytical frameworks. You know, and in doing things differently, a very kind of material politics emerges in aligning with or against, in trying to transform institutions. But I'd finish by just stressing it's not a panacea, of course. These are kind of prototyping capabilities, might be one way of looking at it, whose potential signals more elusive kind of cultural, political and economic possibilities and changes. So if you're interested in digging deeper in any of this, I've listed here a few articles that try and develop some of these ideas out of the projects I listed. But and you're welcome to get in touch anytime if you want to know more. But that's where I'll finish, Machteld, and stop sharing my screen.